Hello, I'm John Loannidis from Stanford University, and it's a great pleasure for me to give this lecture today, even from a distance. Thank you for the very kind invitation. I will try to cover some issues around the challenges that we face in evidence-based medicine, and I understand that we have two options also for questions and answers. So there will be about 10 minutes at the end of this presentation for some questions to be submitted and answered, and I think that you can submit them even while I'm talking. And also there will be a separate session for a more lengthy discussion with Mark Hyman coordinating it. So I will try to focus more on some issues that may be most pertinent to what you do. So evidence-based medicine has a wide agenda, but there are some themes like nutrition and lifestyle that probably are most essential for what you face in your everyday efforts. There's many pyramids of hierarchies of evidence. They include meta-analysis and systematic reviews at the top, randomized trials next to that, and experts and tweets are probably the desert surrounding that evidence. There's lots of desert and very little in terms of construction in the world of evidence. Evidence is less than optimal. Many of the pyramids don't exist or they're destroyed. Why are they destroyed? Sometimes they're bulldozed by property developers. It could be due to financial conflicts. It could be due to allegiance biases and beliefs. It could be any bias that could lead to the destruction or the subversion of the evidence. Eventually, we want to do the best for single people, for single patients, for single healthy people who want to remain healthy. And how do we do that? Ideally, we want to be able to offer the best evidence for each physician-patient encounter. And in the mid-1990s, at the top of the pyramid, you would see in some of the hierarchies N of 1 trials. So the emphasis being on individualizing. We have realized over the years that even though this is so desirable, and even though this is inbuilt in the definition of evidence-based medicine, by David Sackett in the early 1990s, it's not easy to do. Actually, N of 1 trials were largely abandoned about 20 years ago for the following reasons. They were not good if the disease does not have a steady natural history. They were not good if there's a carryover effect for whatever we do as their first choice, and then there may be other choices to follow. They're not good if they're priming effects, and if effects depend on previous choices. They're not good if the disease has a fatal outcome and a relatively short course, and they're not good if there's poor, unpredictable compliance, adherence, and tolerability. So it's very difficult to not have any of these problems. At the same time, we're really still pushing the frontier for individualization, for precision, for personalized precision medicine or health, if it's about healthy people. And I had to resort to the Wikipedia definition for that because I've heard so many different definitions about precision medicine, precision health. So here's what Wikipedia says, is a medical model that proposes that customization of healthcare with medical decisions, practices, or products is being tailored to the individual patient. It sounds great, but I want to remind you that the individual is at the inverse end of the spectrum of the population. And by definition, this means that precision medicine or precision health will be aiming to have the most tiny and the most negligible impact possible at a population level. You really need to be able to have optimal evidence for precision decisions on many, 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 many individuals in order to be able to catch up with some population impact. Another big force is the advent of big data. And again, there's many different definitions, but this is my definition. Big data, which are becoming so prominent nowadays, I just have databases that grow while I'm sleeping. You know, I'm sleeping and electronic health records that I'm going to use are still accumulating data while I'm sleeping. Big data, I think, is defined as data that carries the least possible information content per unit. The more insignificant the content of information per unit, the bigger the big data. It's the exact opposite of the Bradford Hill back-of-the-envelope type of calculation, type of information. You know, Bradford Hill, the father of clinical epidemiology, or epidemiology at large, claimed that I cannot really trust something unless I can repeat the calculations on the back of an envelope. And big data, you cannot do that. Much of the time, they're so complex. They're a black box that is hopefully informative, but until you just plunge in that black box, you cannot really tell how much you can learn. In the current environment, most of the time we're facing a medical misinformation mess. It's MMM, not MNM, but it could have been. And there's 4 components of that medical misinformation mess. The first problem is that much of the research that is being published is not reliable or is of uncertain reliability. It offers no benefit to patients and people, or is just not useful for decision making. The second problem is that most providers in the healthcare system are not aware of the magnitude of this problem. The third issue is that even if they're aware of this problem, most practitioners lack the skills that are necessary to evaluate the reliability and the usefulness of the evidence. And finally, we have patients, families, people who want to use information lacking the relevant, accurate evidence and the skill guidance at the time of decision making. Here's some empirical data about the quality of evidence from the best type of design that we have, randomized controlled trials. This is an empirical evaluation of close to 1,400 systematic reviews that were published on the Cochrane database of systematic reviews within a year and a half, fairly recently. We asked how many of those have grade assessments or grades of recommendation, assessment, development, and evaluation, and we found that only 43% of them had such assessments. Why did the other 57% did not? Most of the time, there was no evidence to appraise. If there's no evidence, how can you come up with an assessment? The quality of the evidence for the first listed primary outcome was high only 13.5% of the time. It was high 91.1% of the time if we took all primary outcomes and we just asked for one of them to have high quality. And then if you were seeking systematic reviews with high quality of evidence, statistically significant results, and someone concluding that, yes, this is a good thing to do and go ahead and adopt that intervention, that was seen only 25 times. So 25 out of almost 1,400, this is less than 2% of the clinical questions being appraised, having both good quality, high quality, and significant results, and a recommendation for action. So why that low quality? What determines quality is the first question that we need to ask. And how does quality affect results? If we can get reliable results from poor quality studies, why not? We just trust what we see, and hopefully this is going to be correct. There has been a lot of debate about whether quality affects the size of the treatment effects and by how much it does that. The early empirical evaluations that were done suggested that effect sizes may depend on aggregate quality score. So you were trying to look at many different things and just get a single number that would tell you this study is scoring a 5 or a 10 or a 0. But this has been largely dismissed because, first of all, there's so many quality scores that the inferences are widely different. And second, you may have 5 quality problems that cancel themselves out, and eventually the answer from that study is about right. Or you may have a single quality deficit that somehow destroys the study. And everything has been done perfectly, but then you have a single thing going wrong and it's completely off. So people then started to look at empirical evaluations where we could target specific quality items or risk of bias items, maybe the best term, such as lack of blinding or lack of allocation concealment in randomized trials. And it was concluded that when you don't have that, you see inflated treatment effects. But it seems most likely that such quality deficits may be associated either with inflated or with deflated treatment effects. On average, they tend to inflate the benefits of treatments, of interventions, of preventive interventions that we see, but sometimes they may deflate. And unfortunately, we don't know when each of these scenarios is happening. It's more likely to happen when we have non-mortality outcomes. It's even more likely to happen when we have subjective outcomes, like how well are you feeling? Outcomes in lifestyle medicine are very frequently of that kind of subjective sort, which I'm not saying that subjective is not important. It's important to know how people feel about themselves, but this means that they could be also more readily biased in terms of the results that we get. Can we get other types of data to replace these kind of iffy results from randomized trials? Of course, there's a lot of enthusiasm that we can use observational data sets to try to do the job of randomized controlled trials. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to work that well. These are data on medical interventions. These are not lifestyle. These are mostly like cardiology interventions where you have two options, two different treatments to choose. There has been no randomized trial done. Someone is using routinely collected data to see which one has the best impact on mortality risk. And you have huge or less than huge, but routinely collected data trying to answer that question with rigorous methods, with propensity analysis trying to correct the imbalances and the propensity of people to be in one versus the other arm. And in all of these cases, in the future, there was a randomized trial done on that very same comparison. So we can compare what the results were in the observational data under the best possible correction versus the subsequent randomized trial. On average, the divergence on an odds ratio scale was 31%. Now, for mortality, a divergence of 5% would be a fantastic benefit. You know, if you can decrease the risk of death by 5%, you've made a big impact on whatever problem that might be. You know, if you cut mortality by 5%, this is great. And most treatments that do work and do affect mortality probably don't affect mortality more than 5%, maybe 10%, the very best of them. So here the noise is 31%. It's many-fold, many times bigger than the signal. So can we trust observational data? Sometimes regulators do trust observational data. For example, we see a number of licensing decisions happening without randomized data. In some specialties like oncology, this is becoming more common. How big are these effects where people say, well, this intervention, this drug, this biologic is good enough, I'm going to license it based on non-randomized evidence? On average, the odds ratio that we see in these cases is about 12. So you can go back and ask yourself, how often do we see odds ratios of 12 in situations of lifestyle intervention? I can volunteer one, smoking. Odds ratio is far more than 12 by all means. Smoking is going to kill 1 billion people unless we do something to stop that crazy thing. But if you come to nutrition, for example, none of the odds ratios, at least for population level effects, are going to be anywhere close to 12. In many other situations, the effect sizes that led to licensing were smaller. And in others, they were larger. You know, some odds ratios were 20, some others were less than 12. They were 5 or 3 or 1.4. In these cases, there was extremely strong evidence. It was like a biologic that acts directly on a single target, and this is all that it does. Does it really work? We don't really know because we don't have good evidence, but in theory, the biology was extremely strong to guide us. In practice, most of the treatment effects of interventions that we face in medicine are so small that anything other than plain randomized evidence would be tenuous. Small does not mean useless. We do have a lot of useful medical interventions, but when we looked across 85,000 meta-analyses with 250,000 randomized trials, we found that it was very, very rare to have an intervention that affected mortality, it decreased mortality by 5-fold, that was seen in 2 trials with statistically significant results at the 0.001 level, and that there was no obvious, clear-cut bias just upon looking at the evidence. Actually, we saw that just once out of 85,000 meta-analyses. And of course, there's some more interventions that are so effective, but most of those have not been even subjected to randomized trials. So it's a little bit like subjecting to randomized trial whether you can fall without a parachute from an airplane. But there are not that many. Paul Glasziou has created a list of about 20 such interventions that have clearly tremendous benefits, and we shouldn't really randomize. If you ask the question, how often we see single studies suggesting huge benefits, like odds ratios bigger than 5, actually this is pretty common. These are some data here that suggest that we do see about 10% of the time single studies, randomized trials, coming up with odds ratios above 5 or less than 0.2. But in 99% plus of these cases, whenever we do another trial, that effect evaporates, either completely disappears or becomes much, much smaller. The reason for that is that the average trial that has this seemingly tremendous benefit is extremely small. On a median, it has only 12 events. So it's a tremendous impact of regression to the mean of a selected result that is unlikely to survive further scrutiny. The literature is further shaped by forces of significance chasing bias. By significance chasing bias, I mean that we all want to find something that looks nice, that looks significant. And there's 3 different dimensions to that significance chasing. First, we have publication bias, which means that negative results remain unpublished. It's the old, well-known file drawer problem. Second, we have selective reporting bias, which means that negative results can become positive by playing around with definitions, with analytical modes, with the way that results will be reported. And finally, fabrication bias, where we have fake positive results, no data exists, someone has fabricated patients who never existed. Fabrication is extremely rare. I think that we do see fraud now and then. When it does happen, it hits the news big times. People talk about it a lot, but this is not really the main problem. The main problem is mostly selective reporting bias. It's the degrees of freedom that we have in analyzing results. And even in rigorous designs like randomized controlled trials, there are degrees of freedom that are very difficult to completely pre-specify, or that we often forget to pre-specify when we run these studies. This is one example from a number of randomized trials that were published in major journals in 2009. We just asked, how often do you get to see both adjusted and unadjusted estimates presented? And these are randomized trials, so in theory, it shouldn't make a difference on average if you adjust or not adjust for some baseline characteristics or for some other factor. Randomization supposedly is taking care of creating 2 populations that should have the same mix of potential confounders. So, there's no real necessity to adjust. However, we did see that there were situations where the adjusted and the unadjusted results disagreed on whether the results was formally statistically significant. And in these cases, typically, when there was disagreement, the authors focused on the significant estimate, even though there was no reason to prioritize that versus the non-significant one. There are some additional considerations in a changing world. Location. Where is research done? Until probably 10 or 20 years ago, most clinical trials were done in Europe and the US, but now we have a major shift in countries that didn't have such a strong tradition of clinical research. And an interesting question is, do these countries get similar results for some things that are hard-cut, like mortality? It should be the same result unless we speculate that there's something in the genetic makeup or the circumstances or the environmental circumstances of these populations that should lead to different results. If that's the case, you would expect to see sometimes stronger results in countries from less developed countries, from less developed environments, and other times the opposite. But what we saw when we looked across the Cochrane database was that almost always, whenever you had results from less developed countries with less strong tradition of clinical research, the results were exaggerated for mortality benefits compared to trials that were done in Europe or the US. And here's one example, a Chinese study claiming an 85% reduction in the odds of death, and multiple European and US studies showing practically no benefit. Can we trust the data, even for our best designs for randomized trials? Some people have started questioning whether we can even trust that the data are what we see. This is one example, study 329. It's not a submarine, it's not U329. It's a randomized trial that led to massive marketing of antidepressants in adolescents. Smith, Klein, Beecham run this study, analyzed the results, and published them in 2001. It showed that paroxetine and imipramine are very effective and very safe for treating major depression in adolescents. But then 15 years later, independent analysts reanalyzed the data, and their conclusion was that neither paroxetine nor imipramine are effective. Both of them have serious harms. In the meanwhile, adolescents were found to have an increased suicidal risk, and there was a huge problem. FDA had to put major black box warnings about the use of these drugs in young people. Is that going to be the case across the board? Should we just be paranoid and whenever we see a trial being published say, well, the results, I cannot trust them? I don't think that that's a sound response. I think that we can have some trust, and we can improve our trust with some proper steps. For example, PLOS Medicine and BMJ in the last 3 years have implemented policies that they will not publish a randomized trial unless the authors are willing to share all the data and the protocols. And we assessed what is happening, whether that policy is implemented. So we asked all the authors of all randomized trials that had been published in these journals after the implementation of the policy to share with us their data. 46% of them did. And I think that you can see that as half empty. I could see it as half full. I mean, clearly, it's much better compared to what we see in other efforts to retrieve raw data, where it's very, very difficult to do that. We also reanalyzed all of these randomized trials, and our reanalysis never reached a conclusion that was different compared to what had been presented in the original paper. There were some errors, but they were minor errors. They were not errors that would affect the main conclusion of the trial. So in an environment where transparency is cherished and where people are willing to have a culture of having their data reanalyzed, we can reach a situation where these results can really be trustworthy. Another final dimension about randomized trials in evidence-based medicine is their pragmatism. This is very important for lifestyle and functional medicine, because we really don't care that much about what is happening in some remote lab with mice or cell cultures. We want to help people in the real world, in real life. So pragmatic designs or pragmatic trials really have to do that. They really have to offer evidence that pertains to real-world circumstances, and there's an increasing interest on really having more of these trials, not trials that are not part of reality and they just ask for things that are unlikely to happen in the real world, but trials that really approximate what is happening to real people. So there's hundreds and hundreds of trials that are claiming nowadays that they are pragmatic. And there's even a very nice tool, the PROCEED2 tool, that has 9 domains looking at eligibility criteria, recruitment, settings, organization, flexibility in delivery and adherence, follow-up, selection of relevant primary outcomes, and primary analysis, including all the data. And we went back and tried to see whether trials that are labeled as pragmatic are really pragmatic. Much of the time, you cannot see a lot of the machinery that would be necessary to see to make such a judgment call, but we realize that very often these trials, even though they call themselves pragmatic, are not pragmatic. So we have plenty of room to improve pragmatism in our clinical trials research. The second part of my talk is going to shift gear a little bit and is going to look not at the ideal of these randomized trials that have all these problems and all these challenges that I mentioned, but how do we make decisions and what type of evidence do we use, specifically in nutrition research, which is one big paradigm for lifestyle and functional medicine. So in nutrition research, we're using mostly non-randomized designs that have impossible to control confounding, and also we use many low-quality small trials. There's large measurement error. Everybody knows that. It is very difficult to measure nutrition, especially with recall biases. there's lots of cherry picking among multiple hypotheses. There's lots of post hoc analysis, so lots of significance chasing along the lines that I described, and of course selective reporting. A p-value of 0.049 is considered to be good enough. There's no registration. There's very limited data sharing. Strong beliefs abound. There's lots of advocates for various reasons. It could be cultural, religious, or personal views. White hat bias. Many people who work in that field, they want to save the world. I think we all want to save the world. We all want to do good. But if that comes into the way of our thinking about, well, I want to save the world and this is exactly how it's going to happen, even though the evidence doesn't suggest so, it could be a problem. And finally, very strong financial interest from big food. It's a huge market, so clearly different companies that produce food and sell food or supplements or whatever, they have every reason to try to affect the results. So here's a systematic cookbook review that I did with Jonathan Schenfeld 5 years ago. It was literally a cookbook review. We opened the Boston Cookbook. It has been published since the late 19th century and has had multiple editions. We picked the most recent one. We randomly checked 50 ingredients from the cookbook recipes, and then we went back to the scientific literature and we asked how many of those have been assessed for association with increased or decreased cancer risk in the scientific literature. This is the list of those tentatively associated with cancer risk. It reads like a poem: veal, salt, pepper, spice, flour, egg, bread, pork, butter, and so forth. And there's 40 of them. The other 10, actually, it's mostly the way that we search. So vanilla is one of the 10 that does not appear in that list, but we searched only with the name of the ingredient. So we searched with vanilla in the literature. If we had searched with vanillin, then we would have found studies that claim that vanillin increased the risk of cancer, or decreased the risk of cancer, or both. Actually, most ingredients have studies in the scientific literature that claim that they increase the risk of cancer or that they decrease the risk of cancer. If you take a look at the lower panel of that slide, you have the ingredients and you have the relative risk estimates. Almost all of the time, there's studies on both sides of the vertical middle line. There's a couple of exceptions. For example, salt seems to be always bad, and bacon, I think, seems to be always bad. But even in these cases, the results are incompatible with just a plain reality check. So take, for example, salt. There's one study that shows a pretty small effect, but the others show pretty large effects. If you translate these effects literally, if you translate a relative risk of 2, it means that with 1 serving per day, you double the risk of cancer. With 3 servings per day, you increase the risk of cancer 8-fold. Or conversely, if you can decrease by 3 servings per day, cancer will go away. So these effects are completely incompatible with any reality check, because obviously it's not possible to just play with a couple of servings of a single ingredient in diet and make cancer disappear just immediately. If you look at the p-value distribution, clearly very, very strong signals of selective reporting. Most of these studies are pretty small to detect modest effects. So even if there are some signals that are true for associations of different nutrients with cancer risk, most of these studies should not have been able to pick them up. So we would have expected the mass of the p-values to be in the non-significance range. And you see that there's hardly anything in the non-significance range. There's significance on both sides of benefit and harm, but very, very little in the middle. Why do we get that? We get that mostly because we have the phenomenon of vibration of effects and the Janus phenomenon. Janus was a Greek-Roman god. He could see in 2 opposite directions. And this is what we get. These are data from the National Household Survey in the US. If you focus on the panels on the right, this is whether vitamin E levels, alpha tocopherol, are associated with the risk of death. And there's 1 million analysis being plotted here. How do you get 1 million analysis from the same data set on the same question, whether alpha tocopherol, vitamin E, increase or decrease the risk of death? Well, you have to adjust for other things. You have to adjust for potential confounders. and there's lots of things that could affect death that you may want to consider adjusting for. There's at least 20 variables that you can adjust, so you have 2 raised to the 20th power options. If you do that, you get 2 to the 20th is about 1 million different analyses, and 70% of them suggest that vitamin E decreases your risk of death. 30% of them suggest that it increased the risk of death. So if you have a strong belief about what vitamin E should do, then you can pick and choose the result that you want to report. Some countries are even worse. Probably US studies are even worse when it comes to behavioral variables type of research. They tend to report even more exaggerated studies. The truth is that most of the lifestyle experiences, and even more so the nutritional exposures, are highly correlated. These are data from the Singapore prospective cohort, the national cohort, and these are just 19 variables out of 2,000 variables that we decided to analyze all against all. So instead of cherry-picking one potential risk factor and one outcome, we just analyzed everything against everything. And these are 19 nutrients. As you see, all nutrients are correlated among themselves. So if you find some association for one of them, you don't really know whether this is the one that makes the difference, or it could be any other that is correlated with it that is responsible for what you observe. Bradford Hill, my hero, proposed these wonderful criteria more than 50 years ago, and at the 50-year celebration a couple of years ago, I tried to revisit them. In the current environment, most of these criteria, unfortunately, are not very helpful. And Bradford Hill actually had anticipated that for each of these criteria. He said, yes, they might work in some circumstances, but, and the emphasis was on the but clause. So strength, unfortunately, doesn't work. You know, most of the effects that we're chasing in lifestyle, if you leave aside things like smoking, are pretty small. In fact, when you see huge effects, they just violate the reality check common sense criteria, and so they're likely to be just exaggerated claims. Consistently, yes, I think that makes sense. We need to see something consistently. Specificity, in such complex networks, it's unlikely that you will see specificity. Temporality makes sense, but it's difficult to document much of the time. Biological gradient, we don't really know. Plausibility can be inferred in almost any circumstances post hoc, but it's mostly detrimental because it is post hoc. Coherence, it's unclear even how to operationalize. Experiment does work, but the question is how exactly do we get unbiased experiments in randomized trials? And analogy, again, is opening the door to mostly detrimental kind of arrangements of our thinking. There are several efforts that have compared observational epidemiology in nutrition and related fields versus efforts to replicate effects in randomized trials. In one paper that I published several years ago, 5 of the 6 most cited claims of observational studies had been refuted within a decade in larger, better controlled randomized trials. Stan Young has published a paper 7 years ago where he looked at 52 major epidemiological claims, and none of them were validated in randomized trials. I would argue that probably his choice of topics was selected, so I don't want to believe that it's 0%, as he claims, but probably the validation rate is pretty small. And I saw that very clearly when I looked at the most highly cited contradicted findings. You're well aware of some of them. They have hit the news big time. Vitamin E and other supplements supposedly having major benefits, not only in prospective cohorts, but in the case of vitamin E, even one trial with 2,000 subjects claimed large decrease in mortality. Claims that flavonoids could decrease cardiovascular mortality by 80%, that low-fat diet is so much better than low-carb diet, or vice versa, that low-carb diet is so much better than low-fat diet, that beta-carotene is highly effective in preventing against cancer and heart disease, again, several trials showing absolutely no benefit, and that fruit intake, which I think is wonderful, and I fully recommend it, can decrease breast cancer risk by up to 90%. Obviously, it doesn't. I mean, probably doesn't decrease cancer risk at all, or if it does by very, very small amount. The problem is that once you have a particular claim based on some wrapping of evidence to support it, which may be very weak or low quality or flawed, it's very difficult to get rid of that. Even if you have very strong counteracting evidence that shows that that was wrong, it will not disappear. And we've seen that repeatedly. We see resistance to refutation. We see that once someone has made a claim, they will not take it back. Even if it sounds completely ridiculous based on the evidence that we have now, they will just stick to it. These are some citation data. The first panel shows what happened to the original paper published in Nature that claimed that beta-carotene is going to be the solution to cancer. That paper continues to be extremely highly cited, and actually it continues to be relatively more cited than the average paper published in Nature in the same year. What do these citations say? Well, practically they say that beta-carotene is effective for chemoprevention, and this is why we continue this type of research, because antioxidants do this and that, and beta-carotene is going to save the world. No mention of the randomized trials that have refuted that. If you look at estrogen for preventing dementia, it's a little bit different. Still, the original papers continue to be heavily cited. It's not that they do not mention the trials that have refuted that claim, but they do mention these trials and they say, no, the trials were wrong. Clearly, estrogen is the way to go to prevent dementia or to do lots of other wonderful things. As I mentioned, we do have randomized trials in lifestyle, including nutrition. Unfortunately, we have a lot of such trials, but they're fragmented and not very reliable. When we looked at the landscape a couple of years ago, we found several thousands of trials on behavior, about 4,000 plus trials or trial entries in ClinicalTrials.gov on diet, on nutrition, and so forth. The sample of these trials, the sample size is very small, the follow-up is limited, the outcomes are not even clearly specified, there's plenty of degrees of freedom that can go wrong. And even when we try to get larger scale evidence, the big data type of efforts still carry even more noise and even more error. There's less emphasis on safeguarding the rigor of the design rather than just expanding the size of the database. So this is the summary of what we know, quote unquote, on how you can die by eating or how you can save your life by eating or not eating. Practically, it can all kill you or it can all save you. This is a very well done meta-analysis of observational data from prospective cohorts by very respectable scientists, summarizing the results very, very carefully. Practically any food has major impact on the risk of death. Let me show you some examples visually. If you eat that many hazelnuts each day, your risk of death decreases, I have an error here. It decreases by probably far more than 15%. I have put more hazelnuts than I wanted. It should be far fewer. If you drink 3 cups of coffee every day, your death risk decreases by 15 to 17%. Actually, this is a paper that was one of the 20 most visible papers across all science last year by a very prestigious team. Tremendous attention. 3 cups of coffee is the way to save your life. What is going on here? Well, each one of these claims may seem plausible if you see it in isolation. Well, maybe it is coffee that does the trick. Or maybe it is nuts. Or maybe it is that nutrient. But when you put it all together, it's unlikely that every one out of hundreds and thousands of nutrients and foods and diet patterns, each one of them is going to give you a 10%, 15% boost in reducing your mortality risk. So the way to try to get a more objective picture is to perform what I call exposure-wide assessments. And this is pretty much what we do here. We use the data from NHANES, and we look at exposures across the entire database. Many of them are diet or other lifestyle, and pretty much nothing has a very strong signal for diet. We see lots of weak signals, but nothing really very prominently standing out. There's lots of weak signals that are at about the same level. There are some strong signals for other things. For example, for smoking. Smoking, as I said, clearly it makes a huge difference. However, smoking, for example, here smoking is measured by levels of catenin, is associated with a very large number of other exposures. And if you say that I will just try to correct for smoking by including it as an analyzed confounder in my regression model, this may or may not work. if you have a huge effect that you try to account for as a confounder, and you're trying to sort out very weak effects, you really need to be surgically precise on the way that you have measured that huge confounder and in the way that you include it in the model. And much of the time we cannot do that. Physical exercise is another thing that probably has, pretty substantive effect. But the way that we measure physical activity and exercise is unfortunately pretty inaccurate. So if you try to include it in a model, it will not capture all of the effect that this variable might have. In the case of beta-carotene, if you take a look at the right panel, there's 68 correlations with other things that beta-carotene is associated with. So all of that observational literature about beta-carotene saving lives and saving people from cancer probably just reflects, who knows, one or more of these other correlations in that vast space that are very difficult to account for. Some lifestyle variables, like in particular nutrients, are associated with most outcomes. You have weak effects, but almost an effect with everything. And that leads to a complete lack of specificity, again, probably because of the nature of these variables being extremely correlated with each other, so that you cannot discern which one exactly is the one that made a difference. What can we do? Well, there are some steps that should be done at a minimum. First of all, I think we need to clarify which analyses are pre-specified and which analyses are not pre-specified. There's nothing wrong with doing exploration research. This is wonderful. It can give us a lot of interesting insights to try to validate, but currently in much of the literature that we read, it is not clear-cut what was pre-specified and what was exploration, what just followed a forking path type of analysis until we arrived at something that seemed to make sense. Use pre-registration when appropriate. I think this strengthens the credibility and the trust that this is something that we had thought about ahead of time. Not something that we just explored. Perform additional large, simple trials with long follow-up. They will mostly be negative. When it comes to nutrition, for example, most of the trials that we have run on nutrients, almost everything, I would say, with very, very few exceptions, has been negative. Is that bad? I don't think it is bad. I think it will clear the space. We will know where large effects are likely to exist and where this is unlikely to be a situation worthwhile pursuing further. Fit the research agenda to the occurrence of small and tiny effects. Abandon designs where noise overwhelms the signal. If we have concluded that an odds ratio is 1.01, I think that running observational studies to chase 1.01s or 1.04s is just a waste of time. There's going to be no way that we will be able to perform the perfectly corrected observational study that can take care of that. Share publicly all data by default. The reason that some observational fields have high credibility is that they have publicly shared the data. For example, I have absolutely no doubt that climate change is happening. And why is that? Because the data have been publicly shared. Everyone can go and see and reanalyze and see that this is happening, that it's not a conspiracy. I know that there's lots of people who don't believe that, but the data are available. Why do I believe that air pollution is a major problem and it can kill people? Because the data have been shared, and even people who do not believe that air pollution is a major problem have reanalyzed the data, and they do see the same patterns. We don't see that in nutrition. Most databases are shared only with people who believe the same beliefs, and they're willing to get pretty much the same results. Share in advanced protocols when protocols exist. Most of the time, protocols don't exist. What exists is probably grant proposals. Grant proposals are not protocols. Grant proposals are efforts to convince that you're a superstar. They're not protocols. I've heard that argument from people who get tons of money from NIH, that we get money from NIH. That's not a protocol. Very rarely have I seen a grant proposal that has even the bare minimum of some basic issues of what you would like to see in a protocol. Disclose financial and non-financial conflicts. I've talked about this before, and I think we should come back to that again. and limit or control involvement of stakeholders with conflicts. If you have a stakeholder who really wants to get a particular type of result, I would say they should not be part of the team who gets that result. There's a lot of debate on how much we can register. And I agree that we cannot register everything. I think that you can ask for registration in some situations where the research is not exploratory. So for exploratory research, I would say this is level 0 for registration. The only thing that needs to be disclosed is that that was exploration. So it was not registered. That's perfectly fine. We can register data sets. We can say that we have these data sets and describe what these data sets are about. It's a little bit like disclosing a nuclear arsenal. I can tell you that I have that data set, and if I press a button tonight, I can launch 3 trillion p-values against you. It's giving you a perception of what these data are about. Level 2 registration of a protocol, if a protocol exists. Level 3 registration of the analysis plan. Level 4 registration of the analysis plan and the raw data. And Level 5 open live streaming. I'm coming to the close of my talk, and if you have questions, please start writing them so that I can take a look at them and start answering when I'm done. But let me finish with a simple trial paradigm, because I think that this is what we need mostly at the moment in fields like nutrition. A simple trial would follow what I call the intention to eat paradigm. So you randomize people to 2 diets and you just follow them for a very long period of time and see what happens to them. Adherence may vary. Lots of the critics of this type of design say that, well, you cannot run a randomized trial unless people adhere to the intervention. No, this is not true. You cannot run an efficacy trial, a laboratory trial, unless you have pretty good adherence. But in real life, you don't really care about whether something is efficacious. You care about whether it is efficacious and people can adhere to it. If a lifestyle intervention is so complex that it cannot be adhered, do we really care if it is efficacious? Yeah, maybe for scientific curiosity, but I don't really care. For example, if I tell you to lose weight by not eating anything for the next 4 months, you will lose weight and all of you will die. So it is very efficacious for losing weight, but no one will adhere to it. So I don't really care. I'm not going to recommend to the general population to just not eat anything. And I think that long-term follow-up and large-scale evidence is feasible in randomized trials. It is as feasible as it is in observational studies. We do have examples. This is alpha-tocopherol beta-carotene cancer prevention study. It was enrolled in 1985 to 1998, and it's still collecting and publishing results. And practically they show no benefit from these interventions. We need to couple that with a manifesto effort for reproducible science. This is a paper that we published about a year ago, and we made a claim that we can vastly improve the credibility of research by focusing on reproducible science, sharing data, sharing protocol, taking care of biases, having an open science framework being prominent, and also by disclosing nutrition research biases. You can read that viewpoint that I wrote with John Trepanowski about a year ago, where I argued that if you have public advocates who have very strong opinions that have been publicly expressed about specific nutrients, supplements, diets, foods, and whatever, this should be disclosed. Much in the same way that you want to disclose financial conflicts. And I'm not saying that these people are to blame. They may be visionary people who are leading the transformation of our world to become a better place. And maybe 20 years down the road, we will all recognize that. But it is important to know who is advocating something and why. To conclude, evidence-based medicine can inform us about the strengths and the weaknesses of various study designs and the state of the evidence landscape. The quality of the evidence is low in most biomedical fields, but we can do better. In lifestyle, and particularly in nutrition, most current evidence at the population level is hopelessly biased and unreliable, and we may need to abandon some types of designs. Bias until then should be taken for granted. In the current environment, the literature is shaped primarily by the biases of scientists, reviewers, editors, often the same people, and sponsors, often heavily conflicted ones with very heavy financial conflicts. And finally, I think we need some major reform, and we do have potential solutions for that reform. I want to thank a number of my colleagues who have participated in some of the empirical studies that I showed you today. Without their contribution, I think I would have been able to show you very, very little. And I want to thank you also for inviting me, and I look forward to answering some questions. So I see that there's a number of questions already, and I will read the questions because probably you cannot see them, and then try to give some brief answer. The first question is, you shared that none of 52 randomized controlled trials confirmed observational data. Is it even worth doing epi for nutrition research? So my answer is that 0 out of 52 is probably an exaggeration. I do believe that it's a low proportion. The 52 were a select sample, and maybe about 5 to 10% of the observational signals might be reproducible. It also doesn't mean that the randomized trial is the perfect gold standard. Randomized trials have their own risks and biases, but it's very likely that the vast majority of signals from observational research do not translate to causal effects, and even if they do translate to causal effects, a smaller number of those would translate to actionable effects that we can actually implement and gain some benefits for people and for the population. So I don't think we should abandon epi research. We should do better epi research. We should do more transparent epi research. Instead of publishing in salami slicing one paper of one nutrient and one outcome at a time, we should do these environment-wide, exposure-wide analysis. So you can think of the Harvard cohort studies that are done by these wonderful scientists, or the EPIC effort. Again, lots of wonderful scientists involved. Instead of publishing 2,000 papers each, have a single paper, with all the associations being analyzed with standardized methods, with consistent approaches, and with a big bird's eye view picture of what we see out of these observational data. I think that would be very useful. I think these data also should be shared. They should be shared for other people to try to see how rigorous the results are and how robust they are to different analytical choices. Some results may be more robust compared to others. We don't see that. We just see fragments that are being published one paper after another, and I think that this is damaging the field, even if it is done by the very best scientists. The second question is, how could N-of-1 studies be used in nutrition research? And here, even though I was critical about N-of-1 trials, because I think that they have been oversold, and we do have experience in the past that shows that they can deliver less than what we hope, it doesn't mean that they should be abandoned completely. There's some very interesting work that shows that, for example, the metabolic response to some simple challenges like, eating one serving of one type of food, or just a plain glucose challenge, is going to be very different across different individuals. And I think that this is something that we can build upon. We don't know exactly how to build on it. Population-level research is giving us averages, and I have to say that we still have a long way to go to get credible, reliable, actionable population averages before we venture into trying to understand these little nitty-gritty N-of-1 type of responses. But it can happen in parallel. I think that we need to understand how big the diversity is, and I think that this can happen at the level of mostly metabolic responses and surrogate outcomes. They're not the final frontier. I don't really know how to translate metabolic responses much of the time into hardcore outcomes and mortality, but I think it would be useful information to have if, in particular, it is coupled with experimental designs, and if it is coupled with transparency and availability of these data to be scrutinized and used by the wider scientific community. The third question is, should we have transparency and open data for NIH Gov-funded research? The big Harvard EPI studies like PHS, Framingham, NHS don't share data. Why? I'm very much in favor of sharing these data. And I can see some of the counter arguments about some of the potential consent not being there for the data to be widely shared, I think that there can be some intermediate steps. For example, maybe if there is very strong resistance because of consent issues, these data could be shared by people who are not completely in agreement with what these studies have proposed. So you need to have this independent reanalysis, reassessment of that evidence, and I think that this should happen. You know, just inviting people who agree with you to participate in your publications is not really going to be very helpful. It's just going to reinforce the same messages, which may be true sometimes, but may be grossly misleading in others. Whenever there's no consent issues, I think that these data should be more widely shared, and even when there's consent issues, there are ways that we can improve their transparency. Another question is, please comment on trials of diet, weight loss, and decrease of obesity, which showed decreased diabetes. So I think that we need more of these trials, and I think that we need larger trials of that sort. I think that we need to have more transparency, we have to have more complete registration, better availability of protocols, more trust in the outcomes of these trials. So obesity is clearly a huge problem. To be honest, we haven't been able to correct it. It's only getting worse. And it's getting worse despite having more than 1 million papers about obesity and diet and nutrition and related fields. So I think we're doing something wrong. And I think that randomized trials are the way to go. They're in the right direction. But I think we need better controlled, more transparent, more open, less biased trials to do that. And there's another question that is being typed right now. Let me wait until it is typed. Okay. Isn't all research in some way biased? For example, David St. Clair studies mitochondria and aging and studies supplements for this. Okay, it's a little bit elliptical, but is all research biased? Well, I am biased to start with. I'm sure that all of my studies have some bias. Bias is inherent in the scientific process. Science is an effort to minimize bias, preemptively, or at least, if we cannot do it preemptively, once we get the data, we try to do our best to minimize bias. Some studies are more biased than others. Some designs are more likely to be biased than others. Some designs and some implementations of research and some types of research practices leave more room for bias to interfere. So I think that it would be unfair to just say, well, everything that we do is biased and therefore we should just quit. I think we should focus more on how we can get our very best shot. And I think we can get reliable evidence. There's lots of things that we know for certainty, and I think that these things that we know for certainty, we should be able to communicate also more widely and act upon them. So I think it's imperative that we communicate more widely to the general public that it's extremely serious and we need to get rid of smoking. It's extremely serious and we need to do something about climate change. It's extremely serious and people need to use MMR vaccines. That's highly certain knowledge. At the same time, if we mess the message with lots of other messages like, you know, here's 5 different ways to save your life with little bits and pieces of nutrition that, you know, most likely don't work, people just get confused. They think that broccoli is at the same level of evidence as MMR. And then they don't vaccinate their kids and they just believe that everything will be fine if they eat more broccoli. And I think that this is a major, major challenge. How do we convey how much research is beyond the question of bias and how much research is potentially biased, and how do we minimize bias to levels that we can hopefully move to stronger recommendations for the population and for single people. I see that that was the last question for this session, so I want to thank you again, and I understand that we have now a second question with interactive discussion, and I look forward to starting that in a few minutes. Thank you.